points of information strongly encouraged to be taken and accepted as per the Welsh Judging Manual, all the standard stuff. All right, without further ado, invite the Prime Minister to begin the round. Here.
Is it much thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. I think anyone who suffers from chronic pain, who is afflicted with mental health, who experiences forms of physicality that make life a little bit harder, know that you often also reconstitute life as something that is synonymous with that pain. Life is painful, but I still live it. Life is painful, but I still live through it. And through living through it, you develop certain coping mechanisms that allow you to successfully live through that. And when you are Job in this instance, and that coping mechanism has been a source of religious relief that you have been socialized into your entire life, you are less likely than ever to want to lose the faith, even when bad things happen to you, because that is the first coping mechanism you go to. That is the one that you have always nursed, that has always helped you through those problems, and that is why you would keep it now. I think there are one key thing to set up in this debate is potentially what time period it happens in. I think this is likely happening in biblical times. Why? Because when we're talking about famous stakeholders, the debate takes place from the perspective of when they lived. So if I said this house as Madonna, for example, it would take place in modern times. Job is a famous biblical figure, probably takes place in biblical times. This has two implications for the round. One, biblical times, no, not until I'm done. One, biblical times are a time when religion is far more superimposed on everyday facets of life, and you see a lot more religious leadership and authority that make you scared to skirt away from that. But I think the second thing is that you just have far less exposure to powerful counter narratives, far less exposure to science, to rationality, to pedestaling of those things. So even when you are exposed to them, there's no famous figures who propagate them, meaning you don't ascribe value to it and you don't even take the time to fully understand it, which means you're far more preemptively dismissive of any type of counter narrative in that regard, which makes you far less likely to question and want to leave the faith. But yeah, I'll take a clarification from Theo.
So you're likely to maybe want to keep your faith, but would you be capable of keeping your faith? And obviously the First Testament is pre-religion, so I assume you mean Second Testament if you're talking about biblical times.
Sure. Yeah. I think the analysis I gave about biblical times and strong religious leadership still applies. In terms of the burdens of emotion, this is interesting. This is sneaky. I didn't think of this, but we're going to stomp this out right now. It's this house would keep the faith. It doesn't presume success. So in the same way that I tell you, hey, you should keep the faith about the break. Don't worry. I know that you still have a shot. What I'm not telling you is you successfully have to keep the faith all the way. And how you internalize that is that I'm going to try. I'm going to do my damnedest to keep that belief. I'm going to do my damnedest to not give up on myself. I'm going to do my damnedest to not give up on what I care about. And so I think it's an approach and it's a philosophy and it's a framework rather than necessary presumed success. I also think we'll show you why it's successful. I would also like to weigh that even if it challenges the time chronological framing, all of the rest of our arguments are going to work in both times anyways. Cool. Okay. What does grief look like? I think the characterization of grief within Job's life specifically has four key characteristics. First, we can presume, and if we know the Bible, he didn't lose all of his family members in one fell swoop. What that means is that the individual instances of grief that he had were spread out and elongated over time, which means he experiences them in more shallow emotional epistemic moments than it would if he were all lost in one fell swoop. I think the second thing is that he has previously rationalized former losses through religion, which means when he experiences new loss, it doesn't become this multiplicative thing where he experiences it to a greater degree and he wants to move away from religion. Instead, he's experiencing the same thing he already experienced. So the most proximate intuition is for him to go back to that same coping mechanism that worked in the past. And to me, the bias towards things that worked for himself before that make him more likely to choose that same coping mechanism again. I think thirdly, you have the ways in which grief often makes you ask questions like, why me? And there are very little stakeholders in society that claim to be able to provide the answer, especially back in biblical times, but even now. And I think the church is one of the strongest voices that say, we can tell you why. We can tell you that you are living within this transcendental hellscape that is a battle between good and evil. And the bad things that happen to you are not your fault. They're a result of existential powers far greater than your own. This narrative is alluring and it makes you feel good and it makes you able to externalize the grief onto something and latch onto it that then helps you process it, which makes you feel even better, which makes you want want to continue to do it, we want to go back to it. And I think the fourth and final thing is that the ways in which that question is answered is something that even if it doesn't provide certainty, because you can't like necessarily see it in real life, it is answered through the framing of how they define certainty for you. What I mean by that is that they don't say you're going to see God in your everyday life. Like no church tells you that. What they tell you is that God is in the world around us. God is in like the crackling of fresh bread over dinner table with like your loved one. God is in like the cool breeze as it like flows over your cheek when you're outside and you're feeling stressed, and that's like a caress from God letting you know that you're not alone, right? God is like the footprints in the sand behind you, if you believe that like really popular like analogy if you grew up in the Christian faith like I did. All of which means is that you reinterpret the certainty of God's presence through things that are easily confirmable, which is precisely why the church socializes you as such. Now, moving into a couple other reasons why I think you're likely to do this. One, I think you grew up your entire life in this. Dinner table conversations, social gatherings, learning about it in school, learning about it through informal education, mentorship, the people you look up to. All of which means you construct your identity around it. And I think as anybody knows, it is really hard to walk away from something that you've socialized into for an extraordinarily long amount of time, because it's so much easier to take the path of least resistance and lead into what you've already been taught. It is so much harder work to do that work on yourself. And I think that when you are in an emotionally vulnerable place like you are, if you are Job, you are even less likely to want to be able to do that work on yourself. I think what this means is a couple things in the round. The first is all your social networks are built around the church. What this means is your friends and your family and the people you love about and care about or approximately in your community, this is a biblical time, are all part of the church, which means you are afraid that you'll be expelled if you leave the faith, right? Or you're even perceived to be leaving the faith. I think this has three implications for the round. The first, or three wangs rather. The first is that this is an optical harm. Even if they're not realistically going to kick you out, although I think a lot of religious communities see your loss of faith as something that is a reprobation of their very fundamental character and identity, so they are likely to do so, but it's optical and you fear it. I think the second thing is that fear is irrational. So even again, if it's not likely that it'll happen, you irrationally or afraid that it will just so anyways, because thirdly, you ascribe such high value on them as people. Particularly, these are people who, as per the info slide, helped you through previous loss. So you ascribe particular importance to your relationships with them, and you want to do what you think will keep their high perception of you, and that involves keeping the faith. I think the second thing here has to do with guilt and shame. Two strands of analysis here. The first is Pascal's wager. Like if you're trying to decide between something that has different levels of uncertainty, you just consider what the potential repercussions or benefits would be. And if the potential of not believing in God is a lifetime eternity of literally burning in hell, it is easier to convince yourself you might as well continue to believe if you've already been doing it. But I think the second reason is that you feel constantly at risk of going to that bad place. Why? Because religion set up impossible standards to make it impossible for you ever to meet them. Under the Christian faith, all sins are equal under the eyes of God. Every lustful thought you have, which you're biologically programmed to do, is equivalent to murder under the eyes of God. What that means is you are constantly breaking God's covenant, meaning you are constantly at risk of going to hell. And that fear and that anxiety brings you back to the church, well, makes you want to work more closely with the church to find ways to avoid the fires of damnation. I also think going to heaven is the best way to see your family. Phil's probably going to talk a little bit more about that. But I think if any of us have ever experienced loss, the chance that we can see that person again, I think we take it.
Thanks for your fine speech. Now invite the leader of opposition whenever you're ready. Hear, hear.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I think several things are going to come in my speech. First, I'm going to characterize what sort of person Job is, because I think there's a huge number of assumptions like Eurocentrism coming from government, and like where this is taking place and at what time period. And I'm going to tell you that just with God is probably equal, like on veil. And then I'm just going to explain to you why this is actually a huge psychological harm for him to continue to believe within this stance. So firstly, what sort of person is Job? And I think like the analysis here, like Job as an act, how Job as an actor would interpret this motion, right? So yes, if they're correct that Job is some sort of like biblical figure, that he's some sort of hero that's written into the Bible by Christians in order to inspire Christians, then yes, he's probably going to continue faith in Christianity. But that's what Christians want to believe, right? But I think we need to characterize that this is an average like religious person. This is an average religious person who does believe in God and has faith in Christianity. It's not some heroic figure, and emotion doesn't characterize a person as a heroic figure. Just because you share the same name as a biblical person or someone who's like presented as heroic in the Bible doesn't instantly mean they're going to have to justify that much more, because it doesn't instantly translate. Secondly, they assume that this is about Christianity. I think this is a Eurocentric reading. We don't know what religion this necessarily is. Okay, so firstly, then what impact will it have if you're this average religious person? It means firstly that things like your proximal needs and like your own like proximal like biological desires hold greater precedent over you than someone who's extremely faithful in their religion and who's willing to sacrifice a lot. Firstly, this is like just empirically true that for the vast majority of like reasonable people, we care about things that physically happen. That is, we care about having like food and water on the table. We care about our health, and we care about avoiding to feel pain. We also care and love our loved ones. I think it's completely like rash for them to just say that like because each member dies sequentially and he's able to have the exact same reaction of like mourning to each family member dying. That's not how grieving works. Like firstly, they're assuming that he's able to even recover from like this sequential huge amount of grief that people experience. But secondly, he has a memory, so he's going to remember all the other people who died in his family. He's going to continually lose hope along that spiral. I think his life continuously gets worse. I don't think they're right in saying that that pain is equal. Since this is an average religious person, he's likely to weigh these things more so than things like immaterial things like faith. Just because he's a person who exists and he's like an average believer, chances are also that he's unlikely to be the most pious person in his population, just because, for example, he has things like kids, etc. And those things are often looked down upon in religion as like things like carnal pleasure. I'll take one for closing. Yep.
Aside from the fact that this presupposes that emotion can't push you closer to God, why are you doing this debate about what someone would like you to do rather than the angel on their shoulder advise them what they should do?
So it is the motion is like I'm giving you likelihood analysis of what sort of actor he is, and then I'm now going to characterize how he's going to I'm going to characterize how he's going to react to that and why he ought to be explained. I think it's a perfectly reasonable way to read the motion. Okay, the third bit of framing is that he has like there's no proof that God exists. Right, and we lack epistemic access to God. I'm going to explain to you, right, why God is likely to be a very bad and malicious God. Because I think the fact that he's testing someone who already has faith in him, and we already know is pious within that God, and the fact that he's willing to go so far as to kill his kids, to remove his health, and shows that he has like very little limitations as to the pain he's willing to inflict on this person. It's unclear, but like we are unclear why God is doing this. But the only way we have of like standardizing and looking at God is through human like characteristics. That's the only lens that we understand. So the moment that we look through God through the human lens, the only conclusions that you can draw from this, if I already truly have faith in God, is firstly that God is like has some sort of maliciousness to him, because we are told that God is meant to be kind and like nice, like a kind person to you. There's no reason that, and if you actually truly can have faith in him, then he ought to know that you have faith. So it's unclear why he has any reason to test you. And so the only reason that you can come to, the only conclusion that you can come to, is that God has some sort of like power complex that he wants you to feel that pain because either he enjoys it or he feels gratification from the fact that you feel all this pain and he enjoys doing that to you. Those are the only interpretations you have, because you know within yourself that you're very faithful, and God ought to know that you're very faithful because God is all-seeing. So it's unclear why God is testing your faith if he ought to presuppose that. So the only reason then is that he's a malicious actor. But even if you don't buy that, he's going to have certain like ways of interpreting this God, and likely you will view this as a punishment from God as opposed to a test from God. And I think this is for several reasons, right? Firstly, because of the proximal need things I've said, which is that God often gives pain to people, like pain and suffering is often perceived as a bad thing, and it's something that God is conferring to you. So you're necessarily going to view that bad thing as a punishment. But even more importantly, right, is that the religious institutions at this time have huge structural incentives to make punishment seem like something that happens to bad people, that God gives that punishment to bad people. I think this is done in several ways. Firstly, right, this is a huge incentive for people to pay into the church and stay within the religion, because people are scared of like, because people ought to be scared of God, and so they are fearful of leaving that faith. And so religious organizations do that. But secondly, right, medieval life sucks and it's full of like injustices, it's full of like horrors, right? The narrative created by the church, and the reason the church has so much buy-in to begin with, is it says that those people are going to receive justice and God is gonna like smite them down and punish those people. So it's a narrative that the church gives that bad people get what they deserve, because this is often the only avenue of justice that people are able to gain in medieval life. And lastly, right, is that if you buy into the church, if you're faithful, then you ought to receive reward. This looks like things like indulgent selling, where people are incentivized to pay into the church in order to be saved, in order to receive benefits within their lives, in order to, this is why like indulgent selling works. So if this person continues to believe in God, then there's a huge psychological harm that he faces. Because he views this as a punishment, it strips him of his agency. Because he has done nothing wrong, and he doesn't know what he's done wrong. And so he doesn't know what to change in his own life. So he's going to live his whole life believing he is a bad person, and he doesn't know how to save himself, which means he's going to live his whole life in fear that he's going to go to hell, and there's nothing he can do with it. So he's lost all his agency and control over his life. This is like objectively terrible for his life, because he also believes that it's his fault that his kids died, because he's a bad person. So he's taking responsibility for that. That's a huge burden for him to hold on himself, right? But also, so what is actually going to happen, and why is this better, right? Chances are he's likely to shift religion, or at least renounce his faith, because of this psychological harm, but also because it's likely for him to view this as like the God punishing him, perhaps because he's believing in the wrong religion, and he should look at alternative religions. This is important because it allows him to recover from the psychological harm he's experienced. Notice that even if this God is not the true God, this God cannot take anything away from him. So rather that internally he feels good about himself, that he's able to psychologically recover by switching religion, and I think that's a good thing. For all these reasons, proud to apply.
Thanks, Peter, for that speech. Now invite the Deputy Prime Minister whenever you're ready. Hear, hear.
Sometimes when we talk about religion and faith, we stray away from the fact that people do have agency with how they engage with their beliefs and have control. And we stray away from the fact that the majority of engagement with religious interactions in your life tends to be through your local community, your priest who's friends with you, who offers you advice, those kinds of institutions. Even if superstructurally these institutions have negative incentives, bad things, for the most part on the ground, they tend to be quite good for a lot of people. We're doing a number of things. But first, you get 2 points to 7. Firstly, I don't want to get too much into this clash on who is Joe, where are we, etc. I'm going to defer to the spirit of the motion for the most part. But outside of that, I'm happy to debate this in the context of things like religious practices in the modern era, primarily across the development of religion tends to be a lot stronger, and that kind of thing. I don't think it's too important for the debate, and I prefer we get too much into it. Secondly, this debate should be judged based off the information and values that Joe holds, alongside our advice on how we should best fulfill his interests, right? Based off the recent judge manual update, that kind of thing. Just more here. People who may not have read it recently. 2 things there. First, starting off response to opening opposition, but the idea of a bad God. If opening opposition think that this narrative is something that causes people to leave religions, and they also think that the reason religions have these narratives is to keep people in them, that is an incoherence in the case. Secondly, I think it's about your human understanding of those religious institutions. I'm going to talk about later why you have the ability to opt into certain kinds of beliefs. I think you should be deeply unintuitive opening opposition's point already. I think it's likely this narrative about religion is mediated through things like community sympathy. The way in which people have been able to say when your first person around you died, when your first famine happened, that it's okay because God is testing you to see if you can pass. He believes that you're strong. Because opening opposition are reliant on there being no plausible interpretation of a God doing this to you while still remaining good. I don't believe that that's the case. The reason for this is A, your pain and pleasure will come primarily in the afterlife, as per the beliefs of a lot of people within a lot of different religions. So you can believe that this life is only just a prelude, that suffering here is not as important, it's just to test what kind of character that you are. You will see your family in the next life. It also, I think, is part of the idea that punishments and benefits happen in the afterlife. So you don't necessarily believe that you're going to be punished in the here and now for doing bad things. So you must not believe that this God is punishing you. There's no reason to believe that. There's no reason why someone would tell you that. There's no reason why you would opt into that. Fortunately. Passing is on the small idea of other religions being an option in those instances. I don't know if these are meaningful options, right? If you've grown up in one particular religion and have a particular set of beliefs about that religion, and you might not know other religions very deeply, you might not know people around you who have these kinds of beliefs, that kind of thing. I don't think this is going to be really meaningful for the motion in that kind of instance. I think it's mostly about renouncing the faith in general, or staying within the faith in general. Two things then. Firstly, unbelief. I think that often we try to seek out earthly reason, right? Because when I, throw a pen across the room, I see the pen move across the room, and I understand that. I understand cause and effect. I understand reason. But the problem is that sometimes things happen that are just random, that are just outside of our control. And we can't find earthly reason for things. We seek super earthly reasons. We oftentimes therefore turn to religious institutions. When these kinds of things happen to us, like what's happened to Job, I think he's likely to turn towards things like religion. And it's often a reasonable thing to turn towards, find some meaning there. What can it allow him to do? A number of things. Firstly, it gives him a means to meditate on these things, a controlled medium where he has a set of ways of understanding it that can be provided by the priesthood to be able to explain to him why what happened to him happened, rather than just being left with the raw circumstantial existence of the arbitrariness of pain. Secondly, it's the ability not to dwell, because you can say it is God's plan. I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to go out and start working. I'm going to make my way to the shop. I'm going to get out of bed today. The ability not to dwell on it, something that you don't have on their side. So there's no way for you to access that kind of thing. I'd like to note here that you do have control. You have control over your engagement with religious beliefs. See, for example, a lot of Muslims will drink alcohol but not eat pork, right? Because they can choose which way they engage with religious practices. There's no alternative way for you to engage with these kinds of emotions. People are often, Job, which is a male name, are masculinized into a sense of denying their emotions, of pushing them down. They bite back against us continuously in our lives. Religion uniquely is a narrative that says that you can explore these things. You can talk to your priest, you can talk to your community about the things that are happening to you in your life through religious language to open yourself up to the emotions that you have, direct to the full nature of your situation. Also opens you up the idea of conditional optimism, because if it is a test, you must have the ability to pass it. There must be an ability for you to do good things and to go beyond it. If it is a test, God must believe that you are strong, you have capabilities, you have these kinds of things. And no, it's not even about whether this is just the only belief that you can have about this. It's about whether you have the ability to opt into these kinds of beliefs that can motivate action. It's a conditional optimism. I can't be optimistic about my life so long as I do this, so long as I get out of bed today, so long as I fight, so long as I get better. I think it also allows you to do things like community engagement, because we characterize by keeping the faith means, totally keeping the faith. Losing the faith means leaving the religious practices. The ability to pass tests is based on the idea to get sugar from your neighbor for a cup of tea. It's the ability to talk to the people around you. It's the ability to ask for help when you need it. And you lose that when you lose the dying social bond that you have with other people in that area.
Do people have the agency or even ability to opt into beliefs that stem from a life of struggle and ultimately probably major depression?
I think that they do have the ability to do these kinds of things. And look, I know that religion isn't always good, right? And I know that you're going to have some reasonable arguments about it later, but I do think that our material here is strong in explaining why we think it's oftentimes a good thing for a lot of different people. Other things it gives you is unique companionship. The fact that you believe that God is always with you, walking alongside you, means that when you've lost people who you learned to speak the language of love to, that you can now speak it again to someone else, and I think that's exceptionally powerful. But it's also meaning, and this is where I'm going to get onto the idea of heaven and hell, because in this world where God exists, and you can opt into at the very least the belief in something like heaven or hell or an afterlife. I know pre-debate you have this belief, and it's something you want to hold on to. I know that even though you don't have proof of God's existence, you have testimony from your friends and family, you have faith, you don't believe you need proof of these kinds of beliefs. It means that you can see your family again, you can hold them at the pearly gates, you can talk to them once more, you can say those things that you forgot to say that you've never meant to say, you can walk back on that last conversation you had where you said something mean, and those kinds of things. It's that hope that drives you through it. And I think this outweighs all kinds of pain in the debate. Because pain and pleasure are ultimately just things that happen in our minds, right? And our ability to consider what we want in our life is based off the idea that we can think of things that happen in the future and weigh on those things. And if you believe in the concept of eternal pleasure or avoiding eternal damnation, if you believe in the concept of love undying, you believe in the concept of heaven on our side of the house. And ultimately what this debate comes down to is whether you have an ability to correspond your circumstances of strong emotion to the world around you. But sometimes, and this is what we tell you, you can't. And in those instances, even if it's make-believe or whether it's real, you need to opt into a system which allows you to think good things again and to have the hope in your eyes come back once more. I'm very proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now I invite the DLO to close out the top half here.
I'm going to take out opening government's case very quickly, because all of their case is about how you gain community from being part of a religion. Why do they need to be part of this religion in order to have that community? We tell you just as easily they can switch religions or join other communities and still have access to those same networks that they say are so important. Furthermore, they can find meaning and agency by being part of other religions. So I don't get why any of their benefits are unique to their side of the house. But the second thing that I want to say is that just because you are socialized in religion does not mean if every single thing has been taken away from you that that belief in that religion does not begin to split, does not begin to tear down over time, and it does not mean that you do not perceive that God is being unjust or that God is punishing you. The fact that they did not respond to this warning from Ahmed's speech is really deadly for them, because it means that none of their benefits actually hold in this round, insofar as we're able to prove to you that you see God as malicious, as you see him as punishing you, and we tell you that this God is fundamentally unjust, which, by the way, is independent of what happens on the ground. If this God is unjust, you ought not believe in him, because he is not the correct religion, and this God is not a good God to believe in. All right, let's deal more systematically with opening government's points before I reconstruct our case. The first thing that they tell you is that when you are in grief, you turn towards religion. All right. Why do you turn towards religion when you perceive it as the case that God's actions, which you see as correlated with every single fabric and thing that you do in your life, are the cause for the horrible things that have happened to you? I think the problem is that opening government very much underplays how horrific these events are. We are talking about his children dead, which children are seen as the products of God in a lot of religions. The fact that this pure innocence is being taken away from him, I think he sees God as unjust. Secondly, it's the fact that he has no wealth and he's completely unhealthy. It means he literally can't even engage with his community if he wanted to, because he's stuck in bed all day and just living a depressed, horrible life that brings him no meaning, because he does not have the proximate means necessary to even think or have a life that is meaningful. So what this means is that just because you believe that God has existed in a part of your life does not mean that he's just going to be like, oh, the crackle in the leaves, oh, like the mouse running on the carpet, like this is God, right? It's much more proximate for him to just say, God is punishing me and I'm a bad person clearly because my children have been taken away from me, my health is being stripped from me. The fact that he's going to read this so charitably, I just think makes no sense, even though he has been socialized to do so. Secondly, we tell you that he thinks that this is going to be a punishment that God is giving to him, because we tell you that he is surrounded by messaging within his community, within religious institutions, not just churches, but in general, that tell him that God punishes people who do wrong things. What do they say in response to this? What they tell you is that, well, no, in religions, like punishment happens in the afterlife. But we're not talking about a specific religion here. And I also don't think it is uniformly the case that in every religion that punishment happens in the afterlife. So let me give you an example. In Hinduism, the principle of karma means that every single day, a good thing that you do results in a good positive outcome for you, but God can also punish you if you do bad things. There are lots of religions, and I think Christianity also has an element of this, which is that you are punished on a day-to-day basis when you are perceived as a bad person by God. This is why you are fated into a life that is bad in retribution for the lack of faith perhaps that you've had in God, or for the bad things that you've done. What does this mean? It means that all of the horrible things that are happening to this person makes this person internalize the narrative that he is a bad person who is irredeemable, because every single good thing that has been taken from him is the most important stuff to him. It's your children, it's your health, right? And so I don't see why he's just going to be like, okay, let me go back to God in order to deal with this. I think what he more likely does is internalize this belief that there is something incorrectable about him, something deeply wrong with him that makes him a bad person, that makes him feel punished. Why is this a really important contribution to the debate? Because we think it means that if he continues to believe in this faith, he believes that he is going to go to hell in either case, because he thinks that God has already determined that he is a bad person. And what this means is that that plague of eternal suffering that opening government wants to talk about is already an idea that exists in his head. He already thinks that it's going to happen, which means he has no agency or fulfillment in his life, because he is consigned to a world where he thinks that he's a horrible person and has done wrong things. Finally, I think this is despite the fact that he has been devout, right? Because we tell you that even though he is like And this is despite the fact that he's been devout. So he's done all of the things that God has wanted. He's gone to church. He's like read the scriptures or whatever. He's made the prayers. He's done these sacrifices that God wants. But in exchange, God does not reward him. And this makes him lose faith in God. But it also means that he sees his life as not worth living because he feels as if his life is faded already towards being bad. Okay, what is the weighing on this argument and why I think it is really, really important? Because I don't think that he's going to be able to get that much fulfillment from his religious community insofar as he believes that the religion itself might not be strong. And insofar as he also believes that this God that exists is unfairly punishing him, or that he believes that he's just a bad person. More than this, if he is literally proximately unable to meet his needs, like he is sick all the time, or he doesn't have kids, or he doesn't have community, I don't get how he's going to access all of these benefits and lead a much more meaningful life. We'd say if he renounces his faith, he has a much better ability to do that because he doesn't feel like his life is meaningless anymore. He doesn't just think he's going to go to hell. It means that he can be parts of other religions or other communities or believe in other gods that have less malicious intentions than the God that is currently governing him, which means he's able to access much more fulfillment in his life. Finally, I just want to
Last chance?
Sure.
So leaving aside the fact that the only major religions with the capital G God are Abrahamic, most people live in specific places with local religions, and they don't have the means financially or otherwise to move to a strange new place where you know no one.
Wait, I don't know what world this is where like there is just like religion concentrated in particular places, and there's no like multiple religions that exist in particular places. But also, I just want to say it doesn't like our argument doesn't rely on him switching religions completely, right? Our argument is that there are other paths of fulfillment that don't require this God, but more importantly, even if he doesn't switch religions, believing within this God makes his life worse because he's forced into this belief that his life is meaningless and that he is doomed and that he's going to go to hell, which makes it much worse for him to access any of the benefits or do anything that he wants to do with his life because of the psychological costs associated with this. So I don't actually think it's as big of a win for you to say that he's still going to be within this religion. It doesn't matter insofar as being within that religion saps his life of meaning every single day. It doesn't matter what the priests tell him. If he doesn't have faith in the priest, it doesn't matter what his community tells him if the God that he has is malignant in the first place. And we tell you why that God is malignant, which means that even if you believe that like he should have faith, if the faith is in the wrong God and this God isn't a good God, he ought not believe in it. At the end of the day, I think that their harms are mainly symmetric, but we proved to you a unique loss in meaning that happens when he continues to believe in this faith. And that is why we urge you to go for opening opposition.
Thanks for that fine speech and all speakers for a great top half. Now just begin the back half of the debate. Invite the member of government. Hear, hear.
Yes, of course, like thank Umar. This is the African debate circuit in UCL. The men's affairs in this room. Lovely to be here. No, in motions about actors, we need to understand not just the actors, but the way in which they engage in their beliefs. Faith in and of itself is a very tricky thing to conceptualize. I want to note to challenge some of the stuff coming out of opposition bench off the bat. I think it's very reasonable that from the info slide that we're likely talking about one of the Abrahamic faiths within the context of this debate. Yeah. These religions are primarily based on the idea that you have an unwavering faith in God as life, and the life that you live in this world is a transitional one that is meant to be quantified by the testing of your the testing of your faith. It's fundamental not to note then that these people, and especially pious people, as Joe is contextualized by the info slide, are individuals who are devoutly religious. It is a massive part of who they are, and it is an incredibly large part of the way in which they live their lives on every day. I think this limits the scope of the opening opposition's claims, but I want to go a little bit further here. Because when you are a pious person, it means that you are an individual who, at the cost of everything else, understands that everything you go through now is for the sake of something that is put off later. It is almost essentially transactional, that you ought to endure the struggles of today at the cost and the idea or the promise of afterlife. I want to do a little bit more mechanization before CEO come and say that, like, you know, it's some of the faith happening some other time and somehow we're not able to claim some benefit. Because note here, when people are actually opting into faith devoutly, they create significant level of, they create firstly an incredible link between these values and the way in which they process the world. That means that when you lose things, you specifically conceptualize that loss as something not just arbitrary, but under the specific guise of this. Open opposition says that somehow this means that you feel alienated by God. But I want to note, oftentimes, God is conceptualized as a benevolent actor. Look, most religions, and specifically the ones we're talking about, conceptualize life as being something that you struggle through, so you're able to accrue some benefit. It is the testing of your faith that gives it value inherently. That's why individuals who often go through the most and have the least are the most devout in their faith. It's why those individuals are able to access the most level of comfort. And I think opening government did a tremendous job in making us understand why comfort is important. I want to understand, and I want to preempt your closing as to why you will always get it. Because note, this person, Job, has gone through a lot. They have lost almost everything that is important to them. They've lost even the ability to occupy their physical body in a healthy way. I think then there is very little time and space you have to get comfort in life. This means that at a point where you're able to conceptualize that loss from the point of view of knowing that there is a reward down the line, you're specifically more likely to keep that faith. It creates a massive capacity to always be comfortable in knowing that when you die and when you move into the secondary place, the afterlife, you're able to see those individuals again. It's the removal of the arbitrary nature of the universe and the way in which all the suffering up until this point might have been unkindly or unjustly occupied against you. I'd love to take a close look.
The info slide says you have no indication of what will happen if you choose to believe or not believe. Hell is not on the table. Equally, you have to make, it is not making the choice to believe, it is believing.
Okay, I won't lie, I don't get the end of this POI, but I will challenge the first bit. Because I think opening opposition equally says, maybe it's not Abrahamic faiths, and maybe it's individuals who have the perception of karmic value here. It doesn't necessarily have to be the trade-off of the afterlife or specifically that. It's specifically the idea that there is some level of reward. Even the idea of nirvana and things like reincarnation are specifically premised on a level on leveling up in terms of the life you're able to live. You fundamentally get rewarded and moved to a higher echelon of life as you progress through it with the ultimate goal of enlightenment. I genuinely am uncertain as to the case to make sure closing opposition is, I don't mean to be rude. I want to note, therefore, there are a few things that I want to, there are a few things that are really important, because how does a pious person process loss? Firstly, they lean heavily on the systems as characterized by the opening government. But more than that, they conceptualize the specific value as a product of that struggle, right? It is why, for instance, the more you struggle, there is an increasing value in terms of the way in which you're occupying faith as a space of safety. I want to know this is incredibly important for someone who even is losing access to things like their ability to live life. When you have your body failing you, you probably can't access things like, I don't know, a beautiful walk on the beach, or the ability to, like, I don't know, a number of important things here. But note, the specific alternative is a loss of faith in this instance. And I want to note what this looks like. Because when you lose faith, I think you struggle even more with dealing with the things that you've lost. Because you no longer understand that even if there is no reward, that there was a level of randomness to the actions that occurred to you. That there was no value to the things that you have done, and there is nothing left at the end of the day. This is important because the specific hopelessness, when you have nothing else, I think is when you give up. It's when you no longer care about your ability to move forward. It's specifically then that you stop trying, you stop living. I think for Job to be able to continue existing as an individual, to claim some level of personhood, whatever this person feels valuable, they need to be able to understand that there is some value in continuing the fight. This is important because religion is specifically meant to provide support. It is the characterization that not only does your faith, the value of your faith come from suffering, but it's the knowing at the end of the day that there is something to be gained from it. This is important for three reasons. Here I want to integrate some responses to the opening opposition, because they say you're likely to process this level of loss and ultimately come out and think that God is unjust, that He's unfairly acting upon you. I want to know this is relatively counterintuitive, given this is a pious person. This person has these values so deeply ingrained in themselves that they're unlikely to question these things holistically. Three reasons for this. You spend majority of your life in it. You might not be in a specific community, but I want to note it is definitely the way in which you quantify things like right and wrong. The absence and the directions of your life are specifically owned on it. And this is why I think CO really can't come up here and claim some weird things that like it's religion, but we have no concept of anything, right? Even in the scope of some reasonable interpretation, there has to be some value or some reason why you do it. I think it's intuitive then that there will be some level of reward